With gaming pushing a new era, we see the story of games push to new boundaries. We have games like Red Dead Redemption 2, Nier Automata, and Uncharted 4. All these games push storytelling past the word mediocre, and that's because they all have one thing in common: good character writing. So, how do you write good characters? Well, as for side characters, you need to establish that role that said character is going to play and how they will affect or be affected by the protagonist and or the player. For instance, Sarah dies at the start of Last of Us 2 to help establish the setting and provide the premise that the game will be taken very, very seriously. And when it comes down to writing a protagonist, you need to give the protagonist a personality, purpose, reason, and motives. But most importantly, you need to give them some sort of connection to the player, either by allowing the player to empathize with the protagonist or have the protagonist be relatable. And when it comes to establishing an antagonist, you need to have pretty much direct opposite. So, now that we got all that out, what does this have to do with The Last of Us 2? Well, let's start with the first issue. 2 conflicting protagonists and unimpactful side characters. When writing a story, you usually have 2 things: an antagonist and a protagonist. The antagonist is the person that's conflicting with the protagonist, and for the antagonist is vice versa. So, Last of Us breaks this concept by adding 2 protagonists who are conflicting. That's not that bad of an idea if they hadn't decided to make us hate one straight off the get-go. But let me explain. So, from the start of the game, it's established that there are 2 protagonists, but what's not established is the antagonist. So, when playing Ellie's part and seeing Abby kill Joel, keep in mind, a loved character, and from our perspective, someone we care deeply about because he was in the first game, we as the player establish a thought that Abby is the antagonist when she isn't supposed to be. At least not necessarily, but I'll touch upon that later and why that works in the game. But intentionally or not, Naughty Dog building Abby up to be a bad character to only crash that concept down would work in retrospect if Abby was given the motive right from the start rather than the middle of the game, but I'll talk about that way further in the video. So, you have 2 protagonists. One is already left at a bad start due to lack of motives and being set as the antagonist, and the other protagonist is already set up for a story, which is going pretty smoothly. As for side characters, we're given empty shells of characters that we, the player, can't build with because they barely last for even half the game. And I'm being so serious too, it sounds crazy. You'd think that these side characters would be in the game, but Dina, Jess, Owen, Mel, Manny are all characters that barely got attention because they had to be crammed to fit all the other characters. They all had barely any impact. I mean, for God's sake, take a page out of Last of Us 1, progress slowly. There's a reason that Bill, a guy who was only in 1 chapter of the first Last of Us game, is more loved than any new characters in Last of Us 2, and that's because he played a role that impacted Joel's progression, but he was also memorable in the sense that he helps build the world in Last of Us. When I see side characters in Last of Us 2, I see people who wouldn't have a big impact on the story if they weren't in the story. Except Yara and Lev. They're the only 2 interesting side characters, but that's for another time. So where does this leave us? Well, this puts us at a terrible point considering that one protagonist is being established for the player to grow with, and the other one is being established as a playable villain. This is where the next section comes in, establishing roles wrong. A vital point within creating characters comes from establishing roles, and Last of Us seems to fail to do this. Let's take Red Dead Redemption for instance. In specifics, let's use Micah Bell. Micah Bell was written to be an antagonistic character, and was created for the sole purpose of being hated. In all things considered, everyone, for the most part, hated him, which in turn makes Micah a well-written character because the role he was given was the outcome of the player's reaction when interacting with Micah. So let's put this perspective in Last of Us 2. Abby was written to be an antagonist turned right, or in their terms, a hated character turned good. And this didn't work out. So this doesn't work out so well, because she was written with the expectation of, at the very least, being liked, but everyone hated her, and that makes her poorly written. See what I mean? If you don't hit expectations of what your character is supposed to be and get the opposite result, then you've written a bad character, or you at least written a misguided character. And I think Abby is a little bit of both. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of issues with Ellie, and I'd like to cover that, but this will just make the video 3 times longer. So with all things considered, where's the biggest issue? Well, that's within how Abby was portrayed from the start. Abby was perceived to be an antagonist rather than a rival. And this is because her motives weren't established at the start, or at the very least, her motives were subtle to the player. If you want to add a connection to Abby, then you need to allow players to see the reason she has her motives. Just like when Ellie sees Joel die from our perspective, having her motives just being established by the middle of the game isn't a good idea, because from Ellie's POV and in the player's perspective, we're chasing down the antagonist. So when we play as the antagonist, aka Abby, of the story, we are set with the expectation to dislike her more. But the story tries to make us empathize with her when it just doesn't work, because she was built as the antagonist throughout half the game. And then for the other half of the game, we were meant to empathize. It just doesn't make sense. But Last of Us truly didn't fail because terrible story or plot. It was honestly just because character writing. Abby did not fail the story. She was simply just failed by the story.